time now for us to meet our second speaker. And we're heading over to another side of London to meet Jamie Hawksworth now. So Jamie's a Suffolk-born photographer who found the medium via a forensic science degree, believe it or not. And he's since built a reputation as one of his generation's greatest image makers, creating work for the New York Times, Vogue, and Alexander McQueen, to name just a few. He rose to recognition first by photographing local communities, initially documenting daily life at Preston bus station in a beloved series of portraits taken over the course of 4 years. In much the same spirit, earlier this year, Jamie released The British Isles, a 300-page book showcasing 13 years' worth of solo trips around the photographer's home country. The result is a thoughtful photographic survey of Britain today, created with curiosity and care. We're very, very happy to have Jamie joining us today. So hello, Jamie.
Hey, Matt.
Hi, how are you doing?
Yeah, very good, thanks. Thanks for the kind introduction there.
Not at all. No, thanks so much for joining us. And yeah, I'm very well as well.
Pleasure.
Thank you. So I guess as per our new look, Nicer Tuesdays, you're not going to be giving a talk this evening, Jamie. Instead, I get to ask you lots of questions, but also so does our audience. So just another reminder to everyone, like you did with Hannah, if a question pops in your mind, do put it in the chat, and I'll do my best to ask it before our time with Jamie is up. So I guess my first question, Jamie, is really, you've traveled extensively throughout your career as a photographer. You've created a book about Antarctica. You've created a film in Higashicho in Japan. Where did the desire to create a body of work about the British Isles stem from?
So it originally kind of started very early on, when I first, like you mentioned there, when I was studying forensic science, then I switched to photography. Because I came to photography quite late, I quickly realized that I really fell in love with kind of fiddling around with the camera and kind of trying to work it out and spending time in the darkroom. And I realized that if I just hit the streets and talk to people and interact with strangers, I can very quickly learn about photography and the way to use my camera and the way to talk to someone. So very early on, I basically just kind of walked around an awful lot. And that's kind of where that kind of spirit of just kind of going out and taking photographs kind of just came from, because it just made so much sense to just spend time actually taking photos. So that's kind of how it started right back in 2007, basically.
It's maybe worth having, I know you've spoken about this before, Jamie, but it's maybe worth having a bit of a diversion before we come back to talking about the British Isles, just to talk about how you, I guess, made that transition from forensic science to photography. It's a pretty extraordinary swap, I guess, in terms of like life direction and everything else.
Yeah, it kind of came out of nowhere, because in Preston, they had this incredible street where they made mock crime scenes, where you would go in on a Friday morning and collect evidence, and you would take the evidence back to the lab, and then you would document it very objectively with cameras. And that was genuinely the first time I properly used a camera, and I couldn't quite believe that you could use a camera like that to document evidence, essentially. And I kind of just and to be honest, in that moment, it was quite I wasn't overwhelmed with photography. I thought, wow, this is kind of interesting. And then actually, I failed my law part of the degree, and I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. And on a bit of a whim, I then switched to photography. And within literally a week, I just completely fell in love. I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't stop talking about it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop being in the darkroom. And I just got kind of, I don't know what it was, but I think what it was to begin with was that for the first time, I could actually use my hands to play around with something and to make something, as in to go into the darkroom, create a handprint, and to load the film and be really tactile. And the cameras are really heavy. And also it kind of, again, for the first time, it kind of gave me an excuse to be curious about things that I never, ever would have ever thought that I would have been curious about. For example, going outside and approaching a stranger and asking to take their portrait. You know, a couple of months before I did that, I would have thought to have done that. And it's I think that's what's so special about photography is it gives you this excuse to do things and go to places and appreciate things that you might not normally do. So I think that's kind of where that fascination started, I think.
It's an amazing story, and what a journey from that, from that course to photography and where you are now. It's really amazing. I guess in our feature that my colleague Lucy Borton wrote about the book, you explained how much of the work was kind of created spontaneously almost, and you're not actually a huge fan of kind of researching endlessly your subject matter. It might be quite surprising maybe for some people in the audience to hear that. Can you just explain a little bit more why you feel that way, that actually spontaneity is good, that, you know, knowing too much can be a bad thing, or researching too much can be a bad thing?
Yeah. I think in my experience, particularly with photography, I think I can kind of stop myself if I try and overthink something, or if I sit at home and be like, oh, you know, I want to say this about Hartlepool, I probably wouldn't go because I'd be so overwhelmed with what that means. And I think that there's such a lightness to not having an idea and to just picking a place that I hadn't been and just to go. And also, from my experience, I just love that sense of a journey, you know, not knowing what I was going to come across, and the unknowing, and the sort of chance nature of who you might meet or what you might see. It felt so light, that it felt really approachable and kind of more accessible to approach things like that. And also, I do think, again, in my experience, if you have that kind of lightness, then things can open up quite quickly in a very normal situation. So someone's hair might become extraordinary, or a puddle or a bench can become incredibly fascinating simply because there's no real agenda. So there's endless possibilities. So I think that's kind of that at the heart of the British Isles, and at the heart of just exploring what's on your doorstep or your home, essentially, is that there's just endless possibilities. And I think that also something very normal can become quite surreal. You know, even this picture here with the guy's glasses and the little Union Jack badge on his jacket, you know, those things I never would have ever thought that I would have come across, but it's those types of things that become, that I just really enjoy looking at and trying to kind of find, I suppose.
And it's worth saying as well, some of the places, I think you touched on this briefly just now, but some of the places that you visited were also chosen spontaneously, right? You kind of went to Euston or St Pancras Station and just kind of looked at the board in some cases, isn't that right?
Yeah, no, completely. And I mean, the majority of the book is exactly that. Like here, for example, that's in Unst, which is the furthest point north in the Shetland Islands. And I was just in London. I was like, right, I'm going to Google what the furthest point north is. And it was Unst. So I was like, right, I'm going to go. And it's kind of, yeah. And even I mentioned before, but even just seeing the word Hartlepool for the first time on the border, I think it was at King's Cross. It's like, what is that going to look like? I've never even heard of that place before. And I must say that I, particularly very early on, I was so, now looking back even, I was so surprised how little I knew about the British Isles, in that, you know, I never even heard of Hartlepool, which is kind of crazy to think about, but I just hadn't had that interest before. So it really put a fire in my belly to kind of just explore, really.
And I mean, this is going to be a difficult question because this is 13 years worth of solo trips around the British Isles, as we mentioned. But were there any, I guess, what were some of the destinations that really took you by surprise? Maybe most took you by surprise, and why? I appreciate that's a hard question to answer.
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think the Outer Hebrides was kind of amazing. And I say that because I basically had to get a ferry from a place called Ullapool, which is on the west coast of Scotland. And I'd never even been to Ullapool. And the fact that I was like, right, I'm going to try and get to Outer Hebrides. I have to go to this place called Ullapool, which kind of sounds bonkers and brilliant. And go in there and then catching the ferry to the Outer Hebrides and having no idea. And I turned up, and as soon as I got off the ferry, I kind of saw this kid with this incredible haircut, and I took his portrait. And it's just little moments like that you can go all of that way, and you come off the boat, and then you find someone and you have that interaction with them. And I'm lucky that they say that kid said yes. And I guess it's just moments like that in a place that I had no idea, like the Outer Hebrides, that you know, to be honest, it's really difficult to pick a place because the Shetland Islands is also like that. But then also really normal places, kind of like Liverpool, Leeds, Newcastle, Manchester. And then if you go through the Midlands and Sussex and down to Land's End or Wales. I remember I went to Bridgend in Wales, and there, when I arrived, there was a sandstorm, and it was bonkers. It was like this little. There's in the book. There's like a kind of picture of a small guy walking through the sandstorm, and I took that picture, and then I found all of these incredible looking girls on a pier, and I took their portraits. So it's kind of, yeah, there's so many places that were kind of, there was a picture just there previously of a big open landscape, and that was actually in a place called Cape Cornwall, down in Cornwall. And that's also, you know, turning up there and seeing that guy just come out of nowhere and completely transform that landscape, you know, was also really great. So it's kind of, yeah, it's difficult to pick a particular spot. But, and, you know, these pictures here were taken in South Shields in Newcastle, and there's a picture of a pram with some candy floss on it. And again, to see that in reality, and it just come out of nowhere was kind of amazing as well. So that, yeah, there's a lot of those sort of moments.
That's brilliant. Yeah, to see that range even in that answer is incredible.
But even the guy. I'm sorry.
No, you go, Jamie.
No, I was just going to say, even the guy there with the black suit on, with the glasses, that was actually in Turkpike Lane in London. And again, just to kind of be walking around and then see a guy in an outfit like that, and for him to say yes to having his portrait taken, you know, all those kind of things align. And it's just really just I'm so lucky that people say yes to having their portrait taken, really. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's lots of questions coming in from the audience, which is fantastic. I'm going to save them just for a few more minutes, but I promise I will get around to them. Yeah, as I mentioned, I guess this book, you know, it's been 13 years in the making, and it's been sort of, I guess, been building as a body of work alongside the rest of your photography. Has it been challenging keeping sight of that bigger picture of what you're trying to do over that kind of time frame, or is this one of those projects that's really only come together, you know, in the edit, as they say?
Yeah, exactly. To be honest, it was never ever a project about the British Isles, really. It was always about just going to a place and just because I hadn't been there and just to explore. Like I really, you know, it was really, yeah, I never kind of wanted to go to a place to try and sum up that place. It was more just, it gave me a really great excuse to just keep taking pictures because I hadn't been there before. And I just kept doing it and doing it and doing it. And I really held quite tightly onto that idea of being spontaneous. So even with even with work that was sometimes commissioned, I always kept that kind of spirit. You know, even if I left the country, for example, I would kind of continue that way of taking portraits or landscapes. So it was always really important to me to just keep it very spontaneous. So it was just never a project until maybe 2 years ago, when I started to really look at what I had. And I have this big wall opposite my darkroom, and I started printing these portraits of, say, for example, the East Coast. And I realized after a week of printing, I was like, hold on a minute, I've got hundreds of portraits here. I could put these all together, and there's the British Isles over this period of time. So it was quite a natural way of putting the book together in a funny way. Because I think if I really thought about it and, you know, 13 years ago said, right, I'm going to do a portrait of the British Isles, I most definitely wouldn't have done it. And it's kind of because it would just feel like an impossible task, I think.
That's really interesting. So yeah, it wasn't a kind of going out there searching for these themes. You were kind of, the themes have almost come through from the body of work at a later date, I guess.
Yeah, I think I do think, and this is easy to say in hindsight, but I do think that if you're just very, from a photography perspective, if you're just very curious in the now, in that you're just out there, then I think naturally the themes and all sorts of stuff and what people might take from the picture, they can kind of naturally just sort of come out, because there's quite a lot of space around a portrait of a teenager, because they're just of the nap, they're just so, you know, they're in the moment. It's kind of, it allows for many different things, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what's really strikes me, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, is that the work, yeah, there kind of feels like there's no judgment in it almost. It's almost like it's trying to be as objective as possible, a survey of Britain, which feels quite unusual in a country that, you know, often feels and is often talked about as being very divided and very polarized. Was that something you were really concerned about as you shot, and then as you, I guess, edited the work, over the years, kind of really trying to make it objective and not too, I guess not too judgmental?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when it came to the actual edit, it was really difficult to edit down, because I just, everyone was as important as everybody else, and particularly in reality, when you get off at a train station and you ask to take someone's portrait and they say yes or no, and then you go to the next person, and then that leads to the next person, then that leads to the next person. When you see that on a contact sheet, it's all really special because of the experience in that moment. So when I came to the contact, when I came to the edit, I think I remember saying to Mac Books that I really want this book to be 450 pages or something absurd like that. And then they kind of forced me to kind of, in a good way, kind of whittle it down. And it was really, really difficult. But to be honest, I never really thought about that as a wider idea, that we're a divided country and things like that. Because again, I think as soon as, in my experience anyway, as soon as I start to think about that and that there's that agenda there, it can completely change the feeling. And I was really conscious that I just wanted to keep as much space around this project as possible. And so, to be honest, in terms of editing, it was more just I being very sensitive to my experience in that moment, and that I wanted to include all those people that I'd stopped. I don't know if that makes sense, but.
No, absolutely, it really does. And there's a couple of questions from the audience that are about, I guess, how you interact with your subjects, which I promise we will come on to. I've just got one last question, which is about the printing process, which I know you do kind of individually by hand. Why is that process so important to you? And I guess, what do you think it gives to this body of work and now this book?
I've always printed myself. Mainly because to be honest, when I first moved to London and I was trying to, figuring stuff out, I remember I went to a lab and and paid someone to print. And to be honest, in that time when I first moved to London, it was so expensive to get someone to do a hand print that I was like, there's no way I can afford to do this. I'm just going to have to learn myself because it's so much cheaper. So to be honest, when I first did that was the reason, was because logistically it was quicker, it was cheaper. I could spend all night in the darkroom printing like a madman and no one would have to tell me to leave. So I did that. And then I very quickly learned that obviously your experience and your sensitivity to color is such an important part of being a photographer, I think. So I kind of held extremely tightly onto that idea. And when I did the Preston Bus Station series, for example, I was really conscious that I wanted the pictures to be very warm, just because I felt like they'd feel much more sensitive to that place, because actually in reality, a bus station is freezing cold. So I kind of warmed up the pictures, and I've kind of always kept on doing that. So that's kind of where that come from.
Really interesting. If anyone hasn't seen that Preston bus station project, you absolutely must dig it out and have a look at it. It's absolutely amazing.
Thanks, man.
As promised, I'm going to get through the audience questions now. Now, Jamie, these are going to go slightly all over the place, but they are great questions, I promise. So Cassian asks, was there a defining moment when your photography career really took off? What would be your best advice to a photographer emerging into the industry? So I guess two questions there, really. What was that defining moment when you felt like it had taken off? And then any advice to an emerging photographer?
It's a good question. I think, to be honest, when I made, with a friend of mine, I made the newspaper. I made a newspaper about Preston Bus Station before the book. I got asked by my old photography tutor, Adam Murray, to come to Preston to do a weekend to create a newspaper. And we created the newspaper, and it had, I think I took 4 portraits and a portrait of a chair. And I basically handed that out across London to all kinds of different places that I really liked. And I started to get a very, very healthy response to it. And that's and then I got an agent, and kind of things went from there. So I actually really do think that kind of little newspaper, and it had a picture of a girl on the cover, and it just said Preston Bus Station. It kind of, I think people really responded to it. So it kind of got my foot in the door, I think. And I think, to be honest, I can't remember fully the second part of the question. Was it kind of how to get noticed? What was?
It was advice to an emerging photographer, but I guess, that's definitely part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, I think just to kind of, and I also, what I did a lot was when I used to go away on the weekends to take a lot of the pictures that are in the British Isles, I would kind of put a portrait next to a landscape and send that to people and say, "Oh, I've just been here this weekend. This is a portrait I found, and this is a landscape I took." And it's very simple. And I 9 times out of 10, I wouldn't get a reply, but then the occasional I would get a reply. And I think just showing people work is also, but then again, that's not necessarily, because sometimes it's very difficult to show work and you're so close to it that it's actually very hard to show people that work. So it's a really difficult one, because there's so many ways. But I think in my experience, I kind of just showed people the work.
That's a great advice, definitely. There's one here from Benjamin. Would you say your forensic science degree influenced your method of working, without extensive research preconceptions, to help you think entirely objectively? Really interesting question there about that kind of forensic science background that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm really honest, I don't think it did, because I think it was it's so obviously going into a crime scene and collecting the evidence, and then being told, right, you've got to photograph this objectively. I don't actually think that when I take photographs, it's subjective at all. In that, it's very subjective. In that, I am actually choosing those people to take a picture of. I'm choosing to kind of take that landscape because I think the light looks really nice. And I think actually it's kind of it's almost the opposite of a forensics picture. So I don't think it's kind of, I don't know if that makes sense, but I weirdly don't think it did. But it definitely sparked an interest, which is, thank God that happened. So obviously, in that sense, it completely informed my pictures, because it sparked the interest, I guess, actually. So maybe it did.
Yeah, it's a really interesting. Well, it's a really interesting answer, because I think I probably was the one who introduced that word objective, which is probably not quite right. But it's a really interesting response there. This is a brilliant question from Liz. With how incredibly spontaneous your work is, are there any times when you missed a shot because you didn't have your camera, or because the moment went by too fast, that you still think about? It might be painful to relive those, but it's a great question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think more so than missing a moment, what's really frustrating is actually when you ask someone to take their portrait and they say no. And there's so many people, there's hundreds of people that have, thousands of people that have said no. And that's the most incredibly frustrating thing. But actually also, to be fair, in Preston Bus Station, for example, when it was such a transitional place, people, moving through there, catching the bus, there were so many moments that I saw that I missed, because I basically, right from the beginning, I thought, well, if I'm going to take a photograph of someone and I can see their face, I have to ask their permission. So there were so many things that I saw that I didn't take a picture of, that in hindsight, I guess I kind of find that I kind of wish I did. But it was always so important to me right at the beginning, for some reason, that I should definitely ask this person if I see their face. So there was a lot of stuff that I missed because I could, it almost felt too observant, like when someone's doing something really funny or interesting and you can see their face, it almost felt like I was kind of snatching something, which didn't quite feel right. Which I don't think necessarily is the case, but, because there's so much beautiful work that people do, and it's still so sensitive, but that you can see everything happening. I don't know if I'm going on a bit of a rant there, but yeah.
No, that's great. In fact, on this topic, Megan has asked, how do you go about asking to take someone's portrait? Because yes, often you won't have that much time, and you're trying to, I guess, imbue a lot of trust in not so much time. So yeah, how do you go about asking for someone's portrait?
Yeah, I mean, actually, just that picture before the pram of the two kids jumping up on the mattresses, that's a great
Mm.
example of I kind of turned the corner in a street and saw those kids doing that. And then I just asked them to do it again in that instance. You know, I asked to take, I ran towards them and said, please, can you do that again? Please, can I take your portrait? And I tend to get quite excited. I don't know whether that's good or bad sometimes, but and I just run up to someone and say, "Oh, your hair looks fantastic." You know, like this kid, for example, I was like, "God, your haircut's amazing. Can I please take your portrait?" Um, and actually, with those two pictures there in the book, that those two kids were actually mates. And the kid with the red jumper, he actually came around the corner while I was taking his friend's picture, and then he let me take his picture, and they had the same haircut. It was like mind-boggling. But so yeah, I kind of just asked, I just go up to someone and say, "Can I take your picture?" Basically, and sometimes they say no, and sometimes they say yes. Yeah.
Interesting. I mean, this is a similar topic as well. I guess it's about kind of how much you direct the people, your subjects. So Alex asks, or says rather, the portraits look very natural and comfortable, with a variety of facial expressions. Do you suggest a facial expression to the person or the people, or do you work with whatever they offer? How much are you kind of directing that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. Ultimately, I think it's always about just embracing the awkwardness or great, if someone does a smile or if someone doesn't, it's just kind of embracing that and letting it happen. Because I think as soon as you start directing someone, which can be fantastic, and that's a whole nother thing, but in my experience, particularly with taking portraits on the street like this, it was always really great to just kind of shut up and let them, not say too much basically, and kind of just take their portrait. Yeah, because also again, like if you're just appreciating that in all its glory and however awkward it gets, I feel like it's it kind of becomes quite an honest portrait somehow.
That's really interesting. I think it's also, yeah, great advice for kind of emerging photographers starting out. Like, how much should you be directing people? How much should you let their own personality come out? It's a fine balance, I think, all the time, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think. Oh,
Dominic,
sorry.
oh, sorry, no, no, go on, Jamie. Sorry.
No, all I was going to say was actually also just in terms of like like you were saying about kind of younger photographers going out and trying that. I also do think that when you do that and you just embrace it all and see what happens, and then when you get back to the darkroom or the computer and you look at the contact sheet, I do think that in the moment, like if it's in a couple of hours later or a few days, it doesn't really register how special it was to allow those normal things to happen. As in, you might look at it and go, God, that's an awkward smile. That really doesn't work. That's not a portrait or something like that. And one thing I have experienced from doing this project is how much time changes the way a photo feels. Like the most awkward, silly smile, or the most like, I don't know, just or the most normal looking person, given a bit of time, can become extraordinary. And I do think that that's one thing I've kind of taken from this whole project is that because in reality, walking around taking people's portraits isn't that extraordinary in the moment. It doesn't feel like this really special thing. It's actually you're just kind of plodding along, carrying a heavy camera, taking a portrait. But then give that time, and then it opens up even more. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Absolutely. No, it really does. Yeah. And I guess over 13 years, you have that opportunity for things to kind of mature in that way. Um, Dominic says, you must have taken thousands of images. I'm sure it is thousands. How long was the selection process over the years? And then when did you feel like this is the moment to collate it? I think you said it was about 2 years ago, but yeah. So two questions there, really. When did you feel like this is the moment to start collating? And then how long did that selection process actually take?
Yeah, so it was about a couple of years ago where I think I can't remember who said. I think it was a friend of mine just said, oh, what happened to all your portraits that you used to do around Great Britain? You know, where are they? Because he'd never seen, you know, he'd never seen, because I was always saying, I've just been here, I've just been there, and he hadn't seen any. So I was like, yeah, bloody hell, I should really look at all that. And that's kind of where I then started, like I was saying about the big wall opposite my darkroom, where I started printing and seeing all the portraits I had. And then, yeah, so it kind of, the reason it took so long was because it just took so long to print everything. That was kind of why it took a couple of years, pretty much, to actually just have the physical prints in front of me that I could then work with Michael and Morgan, who designed the book, and work through them all. And I kind of just had a massive space where I kind of printed out all of the pictures and then just kind of played with them really for about 6 months. Once I'd printed everything, and then the book kind of took shape then. Yeah.
Wonderful. One final question from Jodie. I think we're just about out of time, but the last one is, I was wondering what draws you to a particular image? How do you make a selection on which photographs you want to exhibit, or I guess in this case, put into a book? What is it that kind of draws you to an image? Is there some kind of secret formula there?
God, yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, I don't know actually. What's the defining thing? It's a really good question. I have no idea actually. I guess it could be
different things in different situations, maybe different types of photos.
Yeah. I guess there's sometimes, like I was saying about the portraits, is that again, given a bit of time, there might just be a gesture that someone does. Like I think there's a picture that you've had on the slideshow of an older lady kind of leaning on a post and her feet are in the air, and it was just like, though, you know, a real gesture can come out of no. I think doing the Preston Bus Station series really taught me how to appreciate just really normal gestures, because obviously I was in this space and I was just walking around the whole time. It became kind of a magnifying. The whole place kind of magnified all of these kind of really normal gestures. So I think when I look at contact sheets now and someone is doing just the smallest gesture that kind of really makes that a really honest picture, I kind of run, I run towards it and print it because it kind of, it just feels really, like this kid here, for example, obviously that's an incredibly cheesy smile. And I never would have printed that 10 years ago. I would have come back from, I think that was Liverpool, and I would have looked at that contact sheet and go, God, that's a cheesy smile. But now, given a bit of time and in the context of a book, it takes on a whole nother meaning. That's kind of, and then obviously with pictures like that of the pram, obviously that's such a surreal moment. So those types of things can kind of jump out as well.
Fantastic. What a great question to end on. Jamie, thank you so much. I'm afraid we are going to have to leave it there. I'm sure I could talk to you all day about this, but thank you so much for joining us.
Matt.
Nice to Tuesdays.
Pleasure. Thank you.